I do want to talk about climate change. And by the way, one other thing. This building in the 1980s was what, a spaghetti warehouse? This is an amazing transformation of this side of town, and it's so exciting to be here. And you can't get spaghetti here anymore, I guess, but you get lots of other things and better things. I do want to talk about climate change. What you can't see on the screen, I'm just going to have to talk to you. Imagine if Jesus had PowerPoint at Sermon on the Mount. This is a, could we slide that, push that just a little bit to one side there, to get to, there we are. The last 4 or 5 years of my life, I've worked a lot on climate change issues, or what I prefer to call climatic destabilization. It's not global warming. And on the left, this is the cover sheet for the document that we put together, as David mentioned, on developing a 100 days climate action plan for the next U.S. administration, be it Democrat or Republican. We did focus on the first 100 days, and obviously that time has come and gone. We put together about 250 people, including the current science advisor to the president. And that's the kind of mid-level. The book on the right that I published last year called Down to the Wire is it's a 35,000-foot view of what it means for us to live in this particular era. We are, in climatic destabilization, and I'll explain this in the next few minutes, we are effectively evicting ourselves from the only paradise humans have ever known. And geologists call that the Holocene. And in that period of 10 to 12,000 years, temperatures never went above a certain level. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere never went up about over, say, 290 parts per million. We're now, as of last month, at 392 parts per million. We're radically altering virtually everything on Earth. And I'll explain in just a minute why that is relatively permanent. In the last part of the talk, this is a talk in 2 parts. The last part of the talk is about what this means for local communities. Frank Tugwell and I last saw each other at Copenhagen during the climate meeting in December. And it's fairly clear that this is a tougher issue internationally than we thought it might be, and frankly, than it should be. But there's a whole lot of activity now at the grassroots. It's beginning to build a climate response from the grassroots up. So I want to talk about that project. I want to begin with economics. And you can't read that a bit because the red is washed out. But this is a tale of 2 deficits, and there's a red line coming down like this. That's the economic crisis. You can't read that quote either. This is like a great big eye exam, isn't it? But the quote is from Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan, on October 23rd, 2008, discovered a flaw in his way of thinking. And in the New York Times covered his discovery with these words: "Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself included, are in a state of shocked disbelief. Yes, I have found a flaw, but I don't know how significant or permanent it is. But I have been very distressed by that fact," end quote. Well, that is a picture of I-35 in Minneapolis, which collapsed. This is a picture of Detroit. You didn't have to look at various indicators. You just look around and you can see that we had problems. The economy wasn't working very well. In infrastructure alone, we're $2.2 trillion estimated in arrears on fixing bridges and pipes and water systems. And Detroit, if you haven't been to Detroit, go there sometime. If an invading army had done to an American city what capitalism did to Detroit, we'd be all angry and we'd be declaring war on something. But that was us that destroyed it. Tom Tolles is one of my favorite cartoonists, and this says, "You're under arrest for an illegal Ponzi scheme." And this says U.S. financial system, and there's somebody in there saying, Ponzi schemes, they're illegal. We ran the economy like this, and the point was we were never as rich as we thought we really were. And we discovered a lot of phony bookkeeping and a lot of flawed thinking. And the reasons for this, I think, go back in lots of ways. This, again, is something you probably can't read. The first point is that the laws of what we take to be the laws of economics are roughly from Adam Smith in 1776 to the present but they work contrary in lots of ways to the laws of how the Earth works as a physical system. That evolved over 3.8 billion years. So we have a calibration problem. What we take to be the laws of economics are really, in historical thinking, pretty recent. But the laws of the Earth are something different. This is one of my favorite cartoonists. This is Gary Larson's. Can you all see that? Can you make that out? Now, here's the second deficit. Now, here's where this is the rub. We'll figure out how to handle this red. The reds are not coming through here, but there's a red line that comes down. That's the economic deficit. We'll figure that out somehow, probably temporarily, but we'll recover from that. This is the other deficit, and it's roughly the 7 billion tons of carbon that we add to the atmosphere every year. And so carbon emissions now are higher than they have been, and probably if you take the ice core record, which is a very precise record, and then loosen the standards of evidence just a little bit, you get back to the Paleo Record, and we can go back maybe, scientists say, about 1.4 million years. And we've never been here before. Now remember, we evolved, civilization began, what was it, right after 1945, wasn't it? Anyway. It didn't last long. Anyway, that's the second deficit. Now, this is simply a timeline. Again, you can't read this because of the way the screen's working, but down here there's a name, Svante Arrhenius. And Svante Arrhenius was a Swedish scientist who was going through kind of a nasty divorce and so forth, and he diverted a lot of his marital angst or demarital angst into making some of the most tedious statistical calculations ever made. And they were on the effects of carbon loading in the atmosphere on the temperature of Earth, okay? Now, this is a guy in deep emotional turmoil. This is incredibly tedious stuff, but he got it mostly right. He was ballpark accurate. And so he calculated that carbon load, this is 1897, carbon load in the atmosphere would effectively heat the Earth, and he's roughly within, give or plus or minus 10%, he's accurate. But he was a Swede, and he thought warming the Earth would be a good thing. Now, what there are here, which you cannot read, are the reds are all washed out here, but there are a series of warnings, the 4 IPCC reports and other scientific evidence and so forth. We've had warnings of what was going to happen. And so we're now at about 392 parts per million CO2 and rising rather dramatically. This is a ad from Life magazine, 1962, and it says, each day, remember Humble oil? Humble oil supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. And they've been doing that ever since, and they were right. Turns out 2009 is the hottest, second hottest year on record worldwide. The past decade was the warmest decade on record. And one of the things, this again, you cannot read the reds in this, but one of the great scientific advances in the past 50 years is what's called the science of thermometry, taking the temperature of the Earth, which now can be done very accurately. This slide is interesting. Are there any questions on this one? This actually is important, and I want to walk through this. This is from Nicholas Stern's The Stern Review. Nicholas Stern is an economist with at that time with the British Exchequer. He had been at the World Bank before then, and he was asked to calculate the economic impacts of climate change. So this is one of the graphics in the Stern Review that came out in 2007. Across the top, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees centigrade. Down the left-hand margin, there are variables like food, water, ecosystems, extreme weather events, and so forth. Now, this misleads, if you could see this in the way it actually is portrayed, it misleads in two ways. One is that and the color here tells the tale, or would tell the tale if you could see the color. Going from yellow to orange to red, things get more severe. So as the color intensifies, the problem identified becomes more difficult. Now, it misleads in a couple of ways. One is that where he shows the yellow starting, we know actually that the impact began to the left of that. So things are happening faster and more at a larger scale than had been previously thought. Misleads in a second way. If you made an accurate graphic here, you'd have lots of cross lines here in this slide, because clearly what happens to water affects ecosystems and affects food and so forth. But the point of the slide is this. This red line indicates that we've warmed the Earth about 0.8 degrees centigrade. And in all the reported controversy about climate change and climate science, there's no real controversy about that. That's a hard number, about 0.8 degrees centigrade, give or take. This is the kind of the rub. This dotted line is what we're now committed to. Now, there's a 30-year lag, give or take, between emissions of heat-trapping gases, what comes out of our tailpipes and smokestacks, and the climate-driven weather effects that we see. You all with me? So we're now seeing the effects not of what we did last year, but rather what we did about 1980, that 30-year lag. And the 30-year lag is largely because of the oceans act as a big thermal flywheel for us. That lag will shrink to probably 20 years because of increasing ocean temperature and ocean acidification. In other words, the uptake of carbon that we've relied on to kind of mask the effects of what we're doing is going to begin to disappear. When we worked on the Obama or the Climate Action Plan for the next U.S. president, there's a finely hatched line here. We asked science advisors, including John Holdren, who's Obama's science advisor, and Rosina Beerbaum, and who was Bill Clinton's science advisor, where the point of no return is, where is the point beyond which we should not go. And everybody said 2 degrees centigrade warming, not Fahrenheit now, but 2 degrees centigrade warming. So the point of this slide is we're already committed to something in the range of 1.4 degrees centigrade warming to 1.8 degrees centigrade warming. And the point of no return, the point beyond which we really don't want to go, is now said to be 2 degrees centigrade warming. Now, there's a lot of science involved in this. And this doesn't mean that to the left of that finely dotted line there's no risk. It just means that the risk begins to rise stochastically. It just begins to increase. And so we're in a place we've never been before. Now, you can't read this, so I'll read this to you. This is kind of take a deep breath time. The effects of carbon in the atmosphere are not short-lived, they are long-lived. David Archer, who is portrayed here, a quote is portrayed on the screen. David Archer is a geophysicist that works at the University of Chicago. And in a little book published last year called The Long Thaw, he says the climatic impacts of releasing fossil fuel CO2 to the atmosphere will last longer than Stonehenge, longer than time capsules, longer than nuclear waste, far longer than the age of human civilization so far. Each ton of coal that we burn leaves CO2 gas in the atmosphere. The CO2 coming from a quarter of that ton will still be affecting the climate 1,000 years from now. Now, this hits us where we're weakest at 2 levels. One, culturally, it hits us because we're used to, as Americans, being technically optimistic and solving problems. We like to have solvable problems. A broken carburetor on your Chevy, that's a fixable problem. And we like to think of solvable issues. What David Archer is saying here, and Susan Solomon and other scientists that study this is effectively a permanent change in atmospheric chemistry. Bill Mckibben, the writer and activist, has a book coming out this month or in April called Earth, and it's spelled E-A-A-R-T-H. And the extra A indicates that this is a different planet. So in his view, we've evicted ourselves, in fact, already from the Holocene, and we'll live on an Earth the likes of which we've never seen before. Bigger storms, rising sea levels, rising temperatures, and so forth, and that will continue for 1,000 years. Now, it hits us where we're weak in another sense. If I reach down behind the podium here and I pull out, let's say, an Uzi, and I kind of casually aim it at the front row or the back row, but the back row is the... we have a suggestion. Do I hear it from the back row or the front row? We'll just auction this sucker off. I'd have your attention. Now what happens if faced with a dependably loathsome enemy or a threat, we're good. We were wired by evolution to do that. If it's hairy and fast and has sharp teeth, we're good. That kicks in our fight-flight mechanism. If we have a dependably loathsome enemy, Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein or Adolf Hitler, we are really good. But climate change isn't like this. Climate change is you and me. You have a carbon footprint. I did. I took an airplane out here and left a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. That's us. Here's what we know. scientific consensus among those who study climate for a living. And I want to dissociate those who never took a course in Earth system science from those who did. Those who either eat or don't eat based on peer review, fact, logic, data, and evidence. Now that excludes Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck and a few others. But among the people who study climate for a living, there is virtually no dispute. There are some unknowns, clearly. But the dispute about climate science is fairly minimal. Put heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, you're going to trap heat. Put a whole lot of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, you trap a whole lot of heat. Secondly, it's unfolding faster and larger than anticipated. The scale and duration is global, and effectively, as we measure time, will be permanent. There are tipping points and nasty surprises ahead. And in the last part, the risks are foolish. We know better than we're acting. If we had a national commitment or a global commitment to power civilization by sunlight and efficiency and renewable energy sources, could we do it? I think we could. I think we can. The problem isn't the technology. The problem is the will to deploy the technology. Pogo. Remember Pogo, the cartoonist? Walt Kelly had this right. So what kind of problem is this? Pogo was for those of you who are too young to remember, one of the great cartoonists. This is probably the most famous line ever issued by a cartoonist. Pogo is a possum hanging out in the Okefenokee Swamp down in Georgia, and Walt Kelly has Pogo one day pondering environmental issues. And he says, well, you know, we met the enemy, and he's us. And climate change is that kind of problem. If this was caused by a terrorist, I guarantee you we would have acted by now. If it was caused by Al-Qaeda, we would have solved it by now. But here's the problem. This is a perfect problem, in the words of Gus Speth at Yale. The science is complex. There's a long lag between what comes out of our tailpipes and the climate-driven weather effects that we see. There is inertia in infrastructure and daily habits, and all of us are guilty. There's not a non-guilty person in this room, including me. There's a human tendency to deny this. It's a nice day. It's a beautiful day here in Little Rock, and I'm not going to worry about climate change. There are partisan filters that have been come into American politics. There's right and left, and there's a motivation and collective action. There's global and national, and that gives us the problem. Nicole Krauss, in a wonderful little book called The History of Love, said, it's a novel about a village in Poland before World War II, and she says, there were rumors of unfathomable things, and because we could not fathom them, we didn't believe them until it was too late and we had no choice. Now, that's the way climate change has hit us. And there are a lot of reasons for this. You can't see this very well, but Susan Jacoby's book, The Age of American Unreason, is one of the best descriptions. We have been dumbed down in lots of ways, and Norb Shedler, sitting over here to my left, can tell you lots of those ways. How many of you recognize that curve? Let's see your hands. This is audience participation time. Anybody that does not recognize the curve? 100%. How about that one? Anybody not recognize that curve? How about that one? And then how about that one? This down here is the Keeling Curve, and this is the annual breathing in and out of carbon in the atmosphere. David Keeling went to Mauna Loa in 1958 to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because it was pure out there and he liked to be in Hawaii. And so he found it was 315 parts per million here. Now we're at 392. Now, of these four curves, we have instant recognition of three of them, and probably less than 1% of the American public would recognize the fourth curve. But one of those can kill you. No, I'm sorry. Three of those can kill you. We got a problem with curve recognition. This is a block measuring the news recently. This is all the news attention there was. And so so the space given here in the block is the roughly the proportion of attention in the news media given a particular issue, okay? You can't see that. You have to trust me, you take my word for it. Now, climate change is not on there, and you have to ask why. Well, here this gets is, why have we not fathomed what was before us or refused to see what was evident and emerging in the science? I don't want to dwell on this long, but a couple of thoughts about it. One is that there used to be something called the Fair and Balanced Doctrine that was part of the Federal Communications Act. So if you had license to broadcast the radio or television, if you had license to use the public airwaves, and those are the public airwaves, they don't own them, we do, purportedly. And so if you had a license, you had to be fair and balanced about all the coverage of all issues. Well, That meant if you weren't, you and I could take a radio station or television station to court, and they could lose their license. And so there was, never perfect, but there was more or less, roughly, most of the time, fair and balanced coverage of most issues. That was tossed out in 1987 by the Reagan Federal Communications Commission. And so there's an increasing concentration of media because of that, and loss of media attention to important issues. And then the Telecommunications Act of 1996 helped to concentrate the media so that we're way down to a small number of media, and you'll see this in the next slide. By one accounting, the U.S. press is 53rd ranked against all the other national presses around the world, 53rd. Now, when Ben Bedikian, the great media student, wrote his book Media Monopoly back in 1983, he complained then that there were only 50 major media outlets. He was complaining then. We're now down to 5 or 6, one of which is Fox News. James Madison, who was more than any other single person, was the author of the U.S. Constitution, said, "A popular government without information or the means to acquire it is either prologue to a farce or a tragedy or perhaps both." The Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. did a study of talk radio and discovered that 91% of talk radio is right-wing, hardcore right-wing, and climate change is simply a hoax or whatever for them. And here are the deniers shifting positions. There's a kind of a rogues gallery on the screen. If you probably can't see that, but the first position was it's really not happening. It's some kind of liberal plot, and then it's happening, but it's not caused by us. We're not to blame. And now it's a plot by thousands of scientists worldwide. And so the denial machine, well-funded, is in full force. One last thought about this. We've been through this before. We've seen denial campaigns directed at good science. The smoking campaign that went on for years, we knew, and the cigarette companies knew a long time ago, that smoking caused cancer and emphysema and lung disease. We knew that. And yet they denied this, and this went on for a long time. And it was healthy, cigarette smoking was good for you, doctors smoke, and so forth and so on. Now, one last item, then I want to switch gears here. How do you say hard things to the American public? And the tendency has been for us to blow it off and say, oh, that's just doom and gloom. And I ask you, don't go there. Face the issue. And we have a variety of ways to think about this. The picture on the left-hand side is Jack Nicholson. And this is taken at the movie clip. Remember A Few Good Men? And Nicholson is the commandant at the Marine Corps base, and there's been a murder on the base. And Tom Cruise is the young JAG attorney. Remember that scene? And Cruise and Nicholson face off, and the tension is palpable on the screen. And Cruise says to Nicholson, "I just want you to tell us the truth." And Nicholson's response, where the photograph catches us right here, was, "You can't handle the truth." He spit it out. That's the best imitation I can do. But now, there's a viewpoint here. And the viewpoint is that T.S. Eliot, the poet, put it that humankind can't bear much reality. There's a viewpoint that maybe we can't. On the other side of the issue, this is Winston Churchill. This is the most famous picture ever taken of Churchill. By the way, it was taken by a photographer during World War II in Toronto. And to get that particular scowl, which people assumed was directed at Adolf Hitler, what the photographer did was to snatch the cigar from his mouth and then take the picture. So you're seeing a guy not angry at the Nazis. You're seeing a guy that is in the early phases of oral deprivation. Bombs falling on London in 1940. Churchill didn't go to the English people and say, "Hey, this is a great time for urban renewal." He said, you remember the line? He said, "I don't have a thing to offer you except blood, toil, and tears and sweat." Now, the issue here, when we did the climate action plan for the White House, we brought in a Republican message firm or communications firm and a Democratic firm, and we asked them, help us message this. How would a president, Republican or Democrat, didn't matter, how would a president effectively say to the American public, roughly the equivalent, the climate equivalent of, let's say, Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech after Pearl Harbor? How do you get people galvanized? Now, frankly, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know. Climatic change is the largest change ever brought down on us. We have a denial industry that is active. The science is quite clear. The recent scandal, or quote scandals, it didn't really impact the volume of science. But the issue is, how do you message this in a way that galvanizes the public? So you can't read that, but this is, again, a famous cartoon taken from American Scientist. And what's on the board here is an equation. And his colleague has this plus this, and then in brackets here, then a miracle occurs. And then you get the answer over here. And the point down here is you need to be a little more explicit in step 2. Now, what does a miracle look like? Miracle may be too strong a word, but what do the changes look like? And let me describe something that many of you have been involved with. But there has been a revolution. It is a dramatic revolution in how we make the human presence on Earth. And what I've done on the screen here is list some of these things. Sustainable agriculture and forestry. If we had to feed the world with, let's say, natural systems agriculture or sustainable farming, could we do it? I think the answer is yes. Can you make buildings like the Clinton Library or Windrock or the Heifer Project that effectively are powered by sunlight and efficiency and are beautiful and gorgeous? Can you power the built environment with sunshine and efficiency? I think the answer there is yes. Can you do whole systems engineering and urban design for cities that are walkable and wonderful and really do work? I think the answer there is yes. And biomimicry, changing how we actually make things. Janine Benyus' work in biomimicry is dramatic, and Janine describes how spiders take dead flies and sunshine and make materials stronger than steel by 5 times, tougher than Kevlar, from which we make bulletproof vests. And you think about, how do they do this? This is made at or near the body. It's biodegradable, no fossil fuels, ambient temperature. It's biodegradable. Biomimicry. Can we learn to pattern the way we make things by the way nature has been making things for 3.8 billion years? Landscape design, ecological engineering, industrial ecology. In other words, there has been a transformation in our capabilities, and it's nowhere been on the news. It just keeps on going on. You see green buildings coming on the landscape, and you see projects in various cities and so forth, but the news media doesn't much cover it. The result is we know how to make a world that is dramatically different than the one in which, than the industrial world in which we've been living. We can power this world by efficiency and renewable power. We can develop locally owned businesses and sustainable agriculture and forestry, but there is a different economy now trying to be born. Now, I want to be personal. I want to get down to ground level. I described the book I wrote, Down to the Wire. That's the 35,000-foot meditation on what it means to live in this era. What we did for the White House, and they're doing a second round of this, is that's roughly mid-level, 15,000 feet. I want to come down to Main Street. What's this mean in my town of Oberlin, Ohio, or your town of Little Rock, Arkansas, or cities all over this country and around the world? It's a grassroots up. While politicians are stuck up here, we'll eventually get climate legislation, but they're temporarily stuck. What can we begin to do at the grassroots? And the answer is we can do a huge amount. And we can begin to force the policy system into a radically different direction. It's already happening here. It's happening all over the country and all over the world. This is where I live. This is, you can't see this map, but I'm in the Great Lakes region, and Oberlin is roughly right here. To the east of us, 35 miles, is Cleveland, a Rust Belt city. You can't see the lines here, but this is Youngstown, Ohio. I grew up over here 17 miles from Youngstown, Ohio. That was a brawling, prosperous mill town when I was growing up in the 60s. And that town is now totally derelict. It is as empty and vacant. The downtown is gone. The mills are all gone. That's Toledo, Ohio, to the west of us, and Detroit up here on a straight line across Lake Erie, about 70 miles away. I live in the Rust Belt. So what can we do? We have a project in the town, and Oberlin is a little town of about 10,000 people. It was famous for being reputed to be the town that started the Civil War way back when. We've decided, the college and the city have come together around a project. We want to do a 13-acre green block. Now, we know how to make green buildings. The question is whether we can ramp up the scale now to do whole blocks and neighborhoods, and then eventually whole cities. So the first goal we have is to take a 13-acre block and make this, by the U.S. Green Building Council's rating system, make this a platinum-rated block. and then powered by sunlight, no waste product leaves, it made locally, and then we've added one other criteria to the design team, and that is make this an economic driver in a green economy. Second goal we've got is to get the city and the college together to carbon neutrality, and not do this by 2040 or 2050, but do it within this decade. Move the city and the college both into a whole different energy era with efficiency and renewables. Our third goal is to build a 20,000-acre greenbelt around the city for agriculture, forestry, and carbon sequestration and biofuels. There are a bunch of outcomes we expect. Again, you can't see the slide very well here, so I'll just read this. One is we want to develop the first working model of a post-cheap fossil fuel prosperous economy. I had that title on a proposal. I took that into a friend of mine, Danny Goldberg, who is the rock and roll entrepreneur and manages groups like Bruce Springsteen and so forth. I said, Danny, I need your help. Once you sell things, I said, I need your help selling this. And he looked at that title. It's about 18 words long, and he said, well, David, the first thing is you can't call it that. So we just call this the Overland Project. First outcome is a model of a prosperous, though post-cheap fossil fuel economy. The second is we want to draw a circle around this whole project and make this educational. I want 1,000 students from high schools and colleges, and from our college and the Votech School, and the high schools, local public schools, to work with an incredible array of designers. I want to turn out a generation of young people who understand how you begin to remake the human presence on the earth. That we're not suffered to end the planet, our history on the planet, in the heat death of the earth. The last item here I'm going to kind of leave out, but we want a different kind of conversation that connects all of what we are. Oberlin College, this is going to sound like a pitch for the place where I work, but Oberlin College turns out more young people every year that go on to get their PhDs in the sciences than any other comparable college in the country, and that's true year after year. We're good in the sciences. But on the other side of the campus, there is a conservatory of music, one of the very famous conservatories anywhere in the world, a great drama department. We have an art museum that's ranked right after that at Harvard and Yale. And so we're good in the arts. Now you think about this conversation about human survival. When I was here in the 80s, it was a lot of science stuff and a lot of academic and wonky stuff. And it doesn't move many people very far. Can move probably everybody in this room to look at the numbers and so forth, but out on Main Street, it doesn't get us very far. We need a different kind of conversation. And to get that conversation, I want to engage the arts and the sciences together. And what that means, I don't know. That's where it all kind of sounds airy-fairy, but that's different conversations. That's paying attention to different things. That's beginning to tap into all of our sensibilities. This is the Adam Joseph Lewis Center, and this is the building we did back in the 90s. It's coming up on its 10th anniversary. This is still, I believe I'm correct in saying this, the only entirely solar-powered building on a U.S. college campus. It is a zero-discharge building. There's no waste product that leaves the building. You flush the toilet, and the water is purified and so forth. There's a wetland around here you can't see very well, but this is a photovoltaic array. That's a second photovoltaic array. I got this picture, by the way. I strapped a first-year student to a helium-filled balloon. She's transferred. This is the back of the building, but what we did in this project, we got about 1.25 acres. What we did in this project was to take everything that we had tried to do at Meadow Creek up here in North Arkansas, take everything pertaining to sustainability, and reduce it to the level of a laboratory. So how you grow food, how you build, how you account for energy, managing the wastewater system, the energy systems, and so forth, all of that became curriculum. We had 250 students that worked on the design of this building with an incredible array of designers. This is the template for the larger project. And when Thoreau goes to Walden, he said, I went to Walden to drive some of the problems of living into a corner where I could study them. And that's the kind of thing that we need. We need to take these giant global problems and reduce it to a scale that young people can understand and begin to work on at that scale. When you talk about global problems, they're awfully hard to solve, and it induces despair. But having told you what I did, or having told students what I told you in the first part of this talk, you raise the anxiety level. And then the question for educators is, what do you do with that kind of anxiety? You got to tell them the truth. But then having raised the anxiety, how do you deflect that into something that's positive? I want to do that on this project. So we're putting together a vision for the college and the town, and that's an interesting dialogue between two organizations that have not always gotten along very well, and it's captured in that phrase, town gown problems. We're working on how you finance this, because a good bit of this kind of transition is all about financing and getting banks involved in this. Delivery. A lot of this is simply business development. You could effectively describe this as changing the yellow pages of the phone book. If you look at our yellow pages now under E for energy services or S for sustainability, anything, there are voids. And what has to happen now is begin to fill those voids with different kind of activities. We're looking at public policy, incentives, and how do you get people to do what they really ought to want to do anyway? How do you change the gauges and dials, and what the legal scholar Cass Sunstein describes as nudge people into doing the right kind of things? And then there's training. We put together, or better said here, education. We've got a consortium of the Joint Vocational School, the public schools, a community college, and Oberlin College. And typically, these institutions operate like silos. We put them together in a consortium to ask, what do young people need to know in this world at this time to help build a sustainable, decent, fair global culture? And I'm going to leave the last item out here. This is kind of what it looks like. There is a consortium coming together. The college is the driver, but this includes churches and civic organizations and city government and the college and so forth. We are one of 18 Clinton Climate Initiative global projects, what are called the climate positive projects worldwide. The big ones are in places like London and Beijing, and we're down here, a little 10,000 person Oberlin. This is the corridor. Now you can't see this again very well. Oberlin this is a Google map of the city. There is a corridor that stretches for about 1.5 miles through the city. At the very top of this, the school district wants to build a carbon-neutral school, patterned a lot on the way we built the Lewis Center, so the buildings become its own curriculum. Then this is the Green Arts block, and this is that 13-acre block the college owns. This is the town square. There's a project right here that was begun by 3 former students of mine that'll wrap up in just a few weeks. I've got another student here that owns a restaurant. He actually flunked a course from me and then went on to become a very financially successful restaurateur, runs 2 of the best restaurants in town, and that's when I discovered as a teacher that success in my classes was not necessarily positively correlated with success in life. And that is, boy, for a teacher, that is a terrible thing to discover. He's now bought a vacant grocery store down here and wants to make it an environmental Costco. So there is a corridor through the city at build-out that will involve about $300 million of new construction. That's not much relative to the $1 billion or $2 billion that you put into this side of town, but for us in a small town, that's a lot of money. This is the Green Arts District, and this is an aerial shot taken of this block, again, 13 acres. This is the south side. This is the project I referred to, done by 3 former students of mine. This is a $17 million project, and they went out and begged, borrowed, and figured money and figured out how you finance things with federal support and private lending and so forth. And they're poor as church mice, and they are still poor, but they put together an incredible project. This is ground floor commercial, upper levels offices and condominiums. So one of the goals here is to make a really cool downtown, a 24/7 downtown where people live and work and in close proximity to lots of exciting things. This is the Allen Art Museum. You can begin to see that a little bit better now as the room is darkening. That's a Cass Gilbert building. That's one of the very famous art museums in U.S. higher education. This is a performing arts center, again, facing on the west side of the Green Arts block. This is the college-owned hotel. And this was built to the exacting comfort and design standards of interstate motels about 1955. And did you all hear about bed bugs coming to Ohio? It was in the New York Times, but anyway, bed bugs arrived in Ohio. They arrived in this hotel about a week before the October trustee meeting. And so the trustees were bitten by bed bugs. They came back with a number of plans for the future of the hotel. This was one of them. That is a megaton range nuclear explosion. Now, our president is Marvin Krisloff, and Marvin Krisloff is the former chief attorney for the University of Michigan. And attorneys are paid to calibrate punishment with the nature of the crime. And so rather than go into the megaton range, he recommended simply a kiloton range. But we need a new hotel. And I'm finding out that trying to do hotel deals and all this kind of stuff is an interesting dimension of life. That's again at Cass Gilbert Building on the town square. This is a new jazz center that will be the first LEED-rated jazz center in the world. It opens at the end of April. The opening concert is going to be given by Stevie Wonder. So one of the goals is to make this a destination downtown. I happened to be at a meeting at Stanford and was introduced by a man who edits, or is the editor of National Geographic Traveler magazine. You've all seen that at the newsstand, at the airports and so forth. And he had 3 copies of the magazine there with him, and I picked them up, and they're all places with palm trees and beaches. And I said, you know, every one of those places is going underwater. I mean, we've got a 7-foot sea level rise being projected by the end of the century. Why don't we think about ecotourism in places like Oberlin and in the Rust Belt? So if you want to go off and have a great experience, you can do it. You can get your sunburn and a bag of trinkets and hangover if you want, but we can do 2 of those things in Oberlin. It's hard to get a sunburn there, but we can give you trinkets and we can give you a hangover. But think of ecotourism, of people coming to see things of future because it works. And you can see a glimpse of a sustainable world because it's there, it's all around you. Powered by sunlight, the water for your evening shower is solar heated, the food is locally grown, and so forth, but you get the picture. The components of the project include a new hotel and restaurant, performing arts and music facilities, housing and student housing, and mixed condominiums and business and advanced technology, and an ecological design center that I'm not saying anything about. This is a conceptual drawing of the block, and again, I'm sorry because you can't see that very well, but these are placeholders for the block. This is the key for that block. We're already beginning to see effects in the downtown. So property values are going up. Other businesses are starting to move into the downtown. The word's gotten out that this is going to be a downtown that's going to be sustainable and exciting place to be. So the word has gotten out. This is kind of a rough schematic or depicting a green belt. We started thinking that we wanted one of 20,000 acres around the city. And the reasons for this take some explaining. They're not just aesthetic. I mean, that's important to have to be able to drive into a city and have a nice belt around the city so you have a clearly defined, we like this in European cities, a clearly defined boundary, and sprawl is condensed. But it's more than that. When Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy, went to California about this time last year, he basically said California agriculture is over. At the end of the era or as the era of climate change begins, and at the end of the cheap fossil fuel era, we can't, in Ohio, we can't import food from California or even from Arkansas. We've got to begin to resuscitate local farms. We buy about $7 billion of food in Northeast Ohio every year. We only grow $200 million of that food locally. And that used to be an area that was largely self-sufficient. So anyway, the Greenbelt is to resuscitate agriculture. We're looking for 35 farms. We want to be able to get young people back on the land in the farming business if they want to. Forestry, I don't know where things like this are made here, but why don't we make things out of locally grown and milled lumber and timber and sponsor fine woodworking and craft skills again in a generation that is coming up. I want to be able to sequester carbon and biofuels and green jobs and so forth. And this is a schematic of the organization chart, and this is make or break for us. I think nothing I've described is particularly difficult in terms of technology. Can we build great green buildings powered by sunlight? Yes. Can we do that at the neighborhood or city scale? The answer, I think, has to be yes. Can we grow our food and fiber sustainably? The answer is yes. We know how to make the human presence on this world in a way that's fair and decent and sustainable. The problem is, how do you organize this? And after the health care bill fiasco this past year, we know that organizing this is a difficult kind of thing. It all comes down to politics and human relationships and learning how to trust each other again. This is Bob Berkebile. Pardon me. This is Bob Berkebile at one of our design sessions. Bob's a great architect from Kansas City, and his design team is leading us through this. A couple last thoughts. This is, you can probably make out this line here. This is California investment and business development after AB 32, the climate bill. And you can see, and this is before the meltdown this last year, but you can see the improvement in, dramatic improvement in economy. This is Ohio, the same variables down here. We didn't create the public policy mechanisms to draw people and business into creating solar industries and so forth. This is Sherrod Brown, our senator. You see Sherrod often on the Rachel Maddow's show in the news. He's a great senator, and he's one of our fans and friends on this project. Sherrod, right after I took this picture on the roof of the Lewis Center, Sherrod turned to me and said, "Where did you get that array?" Referring to this array over here, the 100 kW solar array. I said, "Sherrod, our choices were we could buy that array in Germany or we could buy it in Japan. We couldn't buy it in the state of Ohio." And the irony of that is this. A good bit of the technology development for solar photovoltaic systems happened 24 miles away at the NASA Glenn Space Center. But we exported all that know-how to the Japanese and Germans. And then on 50 miles to the west of us, the largest solar manufacturer in the United States is First Solar, but they had committed all of their solar production to Germany because Germany had feed-in tariffs. So there's a lot of public policy work that has got to be done. And we've got to be able to tell investors that you can make long-term commitments in solar, in wind, and renewable energy technologies because we're going to stand behind you and we're going to support them. By the way, Sherrod Brown, I had to introduce him at a large gathering in Akron last fall, and I had 2 pieces of paper in my hand, and I said, "Sherrod, I've got to introduce you." And we were backstage behind the curtain, and said, "I've got to introduce you." And I said, "This introduction is a pretty bad introduction. It's got all your flaws and failures and so forth as a person and politician. This one is a really good introduction. It's about statesmanship and leadership and good for the state of Ohio." And I said, "The difference between these, Sherrod, is whether you're going to support the Oberlin Project or not." He grabbed this one out of my hand and ripped it up and said, "David, I'll support it, but you got to make it the greenest little town in America." So that's our goal. Now, a couple concluding thoughts. I said that climate change isn't fixable the way we normally use that word solution. It's not that kind of problem. We waited too long. The first warning to a U.S. president about climate change was given to Lyndon Johnson in 1965. And that was 68 years after Savante Arrhenius showed us that greenhouse gases would raise the temperature of the earth. We waited too long. So we've got some changes coming. Now, we are in this zone. We've already bought trouble, but we haven't bought yet the final catastrophe. If we move quickly, this is why climate policy, both at the local level and the federal level and also the global level, is now so critically important. If we move adroitly and we move smartly, we can head off the worst of what is otherwise in store for us. And what's that world look like? You may not be able to read this, but that's local food and farms powered by sunlight, with more bike trails and local businesses and regionally appropriate skills and front porches and community. Neighbor as a verb, not just as a noun. Less traffic, no wars for oil, that's almost un-American. No oil-saturated politics, cleaner air, learned self-reliance. This is a world that doesn't bowl alone. This is a world where people need each other, and neighbor, again, isn't just a noun, it is a verb, and it's I've defined it someplace else as hope as being a verb with its sleeves rolled up. This is a hopeful world, not a world of despair, not a world of wishful thinking and optimism, but hope is different. Hope is an imperative. If you're in despair, which is a sin, or you're optimistic, you don't have to do anything. I mean, be optimistic is like being a New York Yankees fan and you got 2 outs in the ninth, and you got a 2-run lead, and you got a 200 hitter at the plate, and Mariano Rivera is throwing smoke, and you can be optimistic and put your feet up and pop the top on another beer. You're going to win the game. But that's not where we are. To be hopeful is to be a Cleveland Indians fan now, which I am. And you've learned all about original sin as a Cleveland Indians fan. But to be hopeful, you have to do something. You've got to roll up your sleeves. You cannot sit passive and say, "Oh, I'm hopeful." Hope requires you to do something. I'm going to end with a couple thoughts. This is a preamble of the U.S. Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It's the only place posterity is mentioned in the Constitution. There is effectively no case law. But now think about this. We are, in our generation, we have the power to deprive all future generations of life and liberty and property. Now, that's the Fifth Amendment, and that's the 14th Amendment, without due process. Future generations have no voice unless it's yours and mine. unless that voice is clear. They have no power to act unless you and I act on their behalf. This is about the rights of life, not just human life, but all life. Oh, aren't they cute? These are my grandkids. This is my stake in this process. This is Maggie. Maggie is coming up on 4. Her mama is an Irish attorney. Her daddy, my son, is a computer executive. And she's also in her fairy princess stage right now. This is Lewis, and Lewis told me, he's now 10, he told me that he wants to be not just in the big leagues, but he wants to make it to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And since I know and am responsible for 1/4 of the genes in his body, I didn't tell him this, but he is roadkill on the highway of ambition. This is his sister, Molly. She is also in her fairy princess stage, and I am their chief consultant on matters pertaining to fairy princess things, and there are big books written on that subject, by the way. And this is Maggie, named after my mother. She is 1 year of age now. This is my stake in the future. And these 4 children, and their grandchildren, as far out as you care to imagine, have no voice unless it's mine. They have no power to act unless I act on their behalf. And the same is true for all of you that have grandkids. Now, oh, that's another picture here. That's Lewis and Molly. They're the ones on the outside. The other 2 are goats. Last slide is this. Thomas Berry, who was one of the great Catholic theologians and scholars of our time, died about age 95 or some such a year ago. Tom Berry's last book was simply called The Great Work. And no generation ever asked for its great work. Those young men who listened to Abraham Lincoln in 1858 at the Lincoln-Douglas debates heard ideas, and some of those men went out and fought for those ideas, and some died for those ideas at places like Antietam and Gettysburg and so forth. But the issue, their great work, was to end the scourge of slavery. And they did it. And in World War II, as some of you in this room, the great work of your generation was to end the scourge of fascism, come out of the Depression, call a halt to communism. That was your great work. And some of your generation died at places like Iwo Jima and the Battle of the Bulge. Nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to take on that great work. They did it, and they did it greatly. What Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation. The great work for this generation, it's rising. My students and all of you here at the Clinton School of Public Service. In a way, it's easy. It's like taking a patient into the emergency room at the hospital. You've got to stabilize, and very quickly so. You've got to stabilize the vital signs of the earth. You've got to stop the emission of heat-trapping gases, and you don't have a lot of time to do that. We're now down to years or decades to make a major transition. Transition to what? Turn the coin over. It is to renewable energy. And the good news here is we know how to do this. This is not a matter anymore of technology. It isn't really even a matter of finance. It's a matter of political will to do it. You've got to develop a global bargain. There's no army big enough. There's no Star Wars shield strong enough or robust enough to protect America. We have to re-enter the global arena. And I think Barack Obama and Bill Clinton have been working hard to do this. But we have to publicly, all of us, join this global society. We don't have an option. And the global bargain is we got to come down from about 22 tons of carbon dioxide that you and I emit on average to 2. And if we make that bargain, it won't be made quickly, but if we make that bargain, other countries, China and India and Africa and so forth, will allow us to survive. But we have got to bargain. And that's the only way that we can guarantee the future of civilization. Fourth, we need a different paradigm. And many of you in the room, or at least a few of you in the room that I know and know fairly well, have been part of that new paradigm process. We need different values. We need to come to a very different understanding of how we relate to each other and how we relate to the world and how we relate to future generations. And then finally, we need a different model for what the good life is. Before they died, Howard Odum, one of the great ecologists of the 20th century, and his wife Elizabeth wrote a little book called A Prosperous Way Down. I wish they hadn't used the word prosperous, but it's a different kind of world. How do we build a world that is fair and decent and prosperous and durable? And that's the challenge. And can we make that kind of world? Well, yeah, I think that we can. Remember all the studies about happiness, human happiness? You've seen that. The economy goes up like this, and happiness, turns out, peaked in the United States at about 1957. Remember that? For me, it was a little bit later, so you have this gap to explain, the amount of stuff that we have, the gross national product, and what we say to be our happiness, and that is a big gap. Well, that's kind of like, duh. We've known that stuff doesn't make us happy. It's human relationships that make us happy. Beyond some fairly minimal level of wealth, it's how we live in those human relationships. We have a very different world to make. I'm really proud to be here. I count many of you in the room as heroes and heroines of mine, and some of my best memories and some of my best role models ever were right here in Arkansas and right here in Little Rock. And people like Sarah Murphy, who was a wonderful friend who passed away, and Tom McCrae, that many of you know. So it's with real pride, and it's a real honor to be here among you. Thank you very much.